No.
Okay.
Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Cecily C.C. Francisco. I am a student here at GW in the Elliott School of International Relations and would like to formally welcome you all to today's program. We'd like to welcome you from the Elliott School and also the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, IPDGC. It's not a mouthful. And we are very excited to have this event here today. As a student, I'd just like to say that it's meaningful to have this. It's something we learn in the classroom. We learn about public diplomacy. We learn about international affairs, but it's another thing to see it translated into practice. And that connection is invaluable for us students who are exploring what we'd like to do and how we'd like to pursue our careers. And I would now like to turn it over for a formal introduction from Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne.
Well, maybe a little more formal, not much though. Anyway, my name is Tony Wayne, I go by. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of one of the partners in this gathering, Public Diplomacy Council of America. That we are very happy to be welcoming everybody together and to be celebrating the research, the hard work that's gone into the work that our friends will talk about from the Lois Roth Foundation. But we have one of the winners is also a member of our group, so he's helping embody the cooperation between the Lois Roth Foundation and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. It's a very special opportunity to look at some of the history of public diplomacy, how it is fit together, and how we are moving forward with this effort to tie cultural diplomacy, the other parts of public diplomacy together, and from our perspective, the rest of U.S. foreign policy or international foreign policy, depending on where you're coming from. They all merge together, usually harmoniously, and part of the lack of harmony is characteristic of all of foreign policy in most countries, where you're trying to sort through the right approaches to different issues to convince people, to win people's support for different aspects of your culture, other people's culture, how it mixes together. So it's a lot of fun. And we learn a lot in doing this and bringing people together. So we not only have the two GW institutes that were mentioned earlier, but we have the USC Edinburgh Center for Communication and Leadership Policy, or contributed to our work here. We have the USC Center on Public Diplomacy, and of course, and you'll get to hear in a moment from the Lois Roth Foundation, who are just been very generous in organizing this group effort by everybody, and allowing the Public Diplomacy Council of America to actually work with them this time in the awards process and part of the selection process. We have a lot of exciting hard work to recognize, and I'm going to ask my colleague, who's right here, Skylar Arndt Prize, to share a little bit from the perspective of the Lois Roth Foundation about this award, please.
Thank you. Hi. So my name is Sky Arndt Briggs. I am the chair of the Lois Roth Foundation, and I thought I would tell you a little bit about the foundation and this award, which is our most recent venture. So U.S. Cultural Affairs Officer Lois Roth died 40 years ago this past January. 39 years ago, her husband, Richard T. Arndt, or Dick Arndt, as most people know him, founded the organization that would become the Lois Roth Foundation. Dick developed foundation programs with an insight that has stood the test of time, focusing on cultural diplomacy awards, Fulbright grants, and translation and literature projects based on his interests and Lois's interests. After leading the foundation for over 25 years, he passed the baton to me in 2014. Already in this period, our board members were discussing how best to honor Dick and everything he had built. Dick had retired from USIA at age 57 after cultural affairs posts in Beirut, Colombo, Tehran, Rome, and Paris. He had not lost any of the passion or convictions that had fueled his career. So in the mid-90s, while teaching at UVA, he embarked on a 10-year project that would become his History of 20th Century U.S. Cultural Diplomacy, entitled The First Resort of Kings, in reference to the famous maxim that war should always be the last resort of kings. So bit by bit, it became clear that a prize for excellent work on cultural diplomacy would be the most fitting way to honor him. But it was not until Deborah Cohen, distinguished professor at the University of Indiana at Bloomington, conducted an interview with Dick in summer 2023 that the pieces started falling into place. And we started brainstorming this idea. Yeah, and then we could have an award and we could, the whole thing. So the Roth Foundation would like to extend its heartfelt gratitude to PDCA, the Public Diplomacy Council of America, for responding to our idea and for the excellent collaboration in conducting both the prize and this event. And we have worked with members of PDCA for years and years, especially I'm looking at you, Sherry Muller. Our combined jury sent out the CFP in spring 2025. Given that it was a new award and no one had ever heard of it, I was not hopeful that we'd receive more than a handful of submissions. But we ended up getting 22 very competitive works. And the decision was so hard to make that we had to split the prize between the two scholars that we will have the pleasure of hearing from today. So I thank you all for being here, whether on Zoom or in person, to experience the first Richard T. Arndt lecture on cultural diplomacy.
Too eager.
But we're eager to have you, and I will get out your way as fast as I can. So it is my sincere pleasure to be here this afternoon and to introduce you to the two recipients of the inaugural Richard T. Arndt Award for an outstanding work on cultural diplomacy. As co-chair of the committee that decided on these awards, as Skye has just said, I can say that we were very fortunate to have an embarrassment of riches that made our task all the more challenging as far as the award was concerned. It was also very heartening to see the important work being done on cultural diplomacy during these very fraught times and witness through these works the power of CD and how it offers lessons for a better future. The two co-winners of the award, each at very different stages of their career, stood out even in a very distinguished cohort. And their books truly honor the work and reflect the legacy of Dick Arndt's own scholarship, which Skye has just mentioned. I'm going to introduce both of them briefly, and then I'm going to let them speak one after the other. So Nicholas J. Cull is fairly well known to many of you in the audience, but I'm going to share just a few light highlights from his distinguished career. He is, of course, a board member of the PDCA, as well as being a professor at USC's Annenberg School for Journalism and Communication. He's a prolific author and has written or co-edited 13 books at last count, which was yesterday, so you can update me if you need. Two of these, Selling War and the Cold War and the U.S. Information Agency, my go-to book on the USIA, received the coveted designation of Outstanding Academic Text by Choice Magazine. Reputational Security was published by Polity Press in 2024. The topics and approaches of his work vary, but whether Nick writes about empire and cinema, decolonization, democratization in Spain, sports diplomacy, or propaganda, the center of gravity in his work is cultural diplomacy. He carries his commitment to public diplomacy to his teaching and service as well. For example, he was the founding director of the Annenberg School's master's program in PD, and he served as the president of the International Association for Media and History from 2004 to 2019. His work and testimony have been presented to Congress and included in reports of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons. And I'm going to just close my introduction of Nick with a brief quote from his book that speaks to the power and the importance of CD. Quote, "Culture is a terrain upon which nations can meet. It is language they can speak. It is a tool that they can use to build cooperation. Cultural work can help deepen relations with friends as a component of alliance building. It can build trust with neutrals, providing a safe space to develop habits of collaboration before the heavy lifting implicit in joint responses to the great policy issues of our age." End quote. Our second speaker, Pete Millwood, is on Zoom, and he is lecturer in East Asian history at the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. He has held fellowships at the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at the University of Hong Kong and the International History Department at the London School of Economics and elsewhere. Improbable Diplomats, which was published by Cambridge in 2023, is his first book. It is deeply researched and draws on broad archives in US and China, some of which have since been culled. It was also a finalist for the 2024 Southern Methodist University's Center for Presidential History Book Prize. In addition to his book, he has also published on various aspects of Chinese-American diplomacy in multiple venues. One of his publications, The US and Chinese Discourses on Science in the People's Republic of China, was the winner of the Early Career Scholar Best Paper from the Commission on Science, Technology, and Diplomacy, or STAND. Professor Millwood has additionally served as co-editor of the massive Routledge Resources Online, The Cold War. He is also very much a public-facing scholar. He has used his research to address key issues for a general public and, crucially, teachers in venues such as The Interpreter, Agora, The Washington Post, The Conversation, and more. His work has also been quoted in The Voice of America, NBC, Radio Canada, and numerous other sources. His accomplishments have been recognized with an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award, a Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, International Visiting Fellowship, a Cluj Fellowship from the Library of Congress, and many more. And I want to briefly flag a key part of Pete's argument that's extremely relevant now as we are seeing cuts to international education and exchanges. Improbable Diplomats highlights how exchanges didn't just connect people or peoples. They also exerted a powerful influence on the diplomatic relationship between the two governments. Indeed, these exchanges, quote, were at the vanguard of negotiating China and America's transition from their mutual isolation in the 1950s and 1960s to the cooperation of the 70s and the decades that followed. Pete additionally wrote in 2024 that, quote, the lessons of Sino-American relations of the 1970s, especially societal relations, are more relevant now than they have ever been, and may be instructive as to how to maintain a constructive relationship, even in the face of fundamental widening differences in values and interests, end quote. These are all lessons that we would do well in considering today. Please join me in welcoming Nick, Cull, and Pete Millwood.
Well, thank you so much for this honor and for this event. I'm very touched to receive the award, both because of my regard for the Roth Foundation and its work, but more especially because of Dick and my affection for him and respect for him. And it's just wonderful that Sky's here to make it official. So what I want to spend the next few minutes doing is giving you a little bit of background to the book, which is being recognized here, Reputational Security, the book and its implications for cultural diplomacy. I want to talk about the mismatch that I saw in the relationship between theory and reality around issues of culture that prompted the book, something about the concept, and then how the concept of reputational security has implications for cultural diplomacy. I want to lay out what I see as the way ahead for cultural diplomacy, which of course has never been so needed. And in a nutshell, the task I see for cultural diplomacy is what I have termed engineering empathy. I tried out that phrase on Dick, and he said, "Oh, for goodness sake, don't say that. It makes it sound like, we're too mechanical. You can't say that." But I thought, well, I'll try. So I am using this phrase, engineering empathy. But in essence, what I want to do is bring that part of, as Tony will remember from diplomat training, you're told if you're ever kidnapped, the thing to do is as soon as possible, build a rapport with your captor. Tell them the little human details that show you're a person with hopes and dreams and family members and your own experience of the world. One way of thinking about cultural diplomacy as a tool of defense is to think of it as that same process, but at scale, where we're all captive of one another in this world. And through cultural diplomacy, we can make ourselves more than stereotypes. We can make ourselves real and worthy of empathy of those on whom, in the last analysis, we will depend. So first of all, this mismatch. Well, the mismatch really became undeniable for me in Kazakhstan in 2017, when I was in a discussion of soft power with the director of their diplomatic academy. It happened to take place in Starbucks, and I was asking him about Kazakh soft power and how the country was trying to build up a soft power in the world. And he said, "I really don't accept that frame." And it emerged that as he saw soft power, it was implying that you were aiming for something extra. You wanted people to give you something to gain some kind of advantage. And he said that for him, Kazakhstan just wasn't looking for an advantage. We also both agreed that soft power was only measurable at the top. The indices were, there's one called the Soft Power 30, which with 170 countries, does it mean there's a no power 170 or a repulsive 170? There's something wrong if our metric is only visible at the top. The reality that we talked about was one where image is part of defense, where he was seeking to shield Kazakhstan from things being taken away, from a neighbor coming and claiming a province. And his hope was that if his country was well enough known in the world, it would make that harder to do. And so in our back and forth, I tried to find a phrase that he would find acceptable. And I said, what you're describing then is reputational security. And he said, yes, that's exactly what he was describing. I then road tested the term with other officials in other places around, well, the easiest to say, the Russian near abroad, and everybody thought that it fitted what they were thinking about, what they needed. It also worked very well historically. So this is my fleshing out of the term. Of course, reputation is an old part of statecraft. You can go back to Alexander and see how leaders have understood that a reputation precedes them and allows them to get things done, including extending influence, and a part of that is a defensive capacity. However, when IR theory looked on responses, it looked on reputation, it tended to put that through a sort of a filter of how would a particular leader respond? So what would your reputation, what are the implications of your reputation for a confrontation? Would you launch a nuclear weapon or something like that? So the concept hadn't been explored as one might wish in international relations, but was very much part of how we thought about the global market. Best example being the emergence of the idea of a national brand as a element of analysis, and then actually something that some countries were trying to change. As a historian, I could see that reputation had been an important part of how crises worked. And I was haunted by the explanation that the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain gave for why he would not defend Czechoslovakia in September 1938. He said on the radio that it was terrible to consider war to defend a far country and people of whom we know nothing. As if, had Czechoslovakia resonated more in the British imagination, a different foreign policy would have come from that. So my comparison was to then look at Poland, which was much better known in Britain, and to see, well, was there a different attitude to Poland? And indeed, there was. There was a treaty to underwrite Poland 6 months later. Poland was much better known by the British public. Twice as many references to Poland than Czechoslovakia in the London Times, 4 times as many in the Manchester Guardian. There was great familiarity with Poland. Czechoslovakia, people weren't sure what it meant, and Czech scholars today feel that this was part of their tragedy. Soft power, the term that, or the concept that has really dominated public diplomacy thinking, I found very useful, but it tends to be positive, dealing with the good things about a place, and it tends to be unilateral, assuming that the whole world is a sort of a beauty contest of the most successful countries, and that the success of one country is the defeat of another. So if somebody starts to learn Italian in Turkey, that's a defeat for France, rather than a success for the influence of Europe. When I thought about reputational security, I very much wanted it to include the moments when countries acknowledge that there is something in their reality, maybe their cultural reality, which has to change for the benefit of their security. 2 clear examples of this are the Chinese government's decision to stop foot binding round about 1900, so that China will look better in the world, not because of the welfare of Chinese women, and the decision of Eisenhower and Kennedy both to do something about civil rights. They understood that the best way to combat the Soviet allegation of American racism was to actually be less racist, not to simply say, well, come and see the Grand Canyon, it's a fabulous hole in the ground. Reputational security describes the world today. Think of the way in which during COVID, the superpowers tried to blame one another for the outbreak, or the way in which reputational attacks were part of the Gulf crisis before the pandemic. But it was what happened to Ukraine that really sealed my attachment to this concept. Ukraine in 2014 had no reputation in the NATO countries and lost a province when Russia invaded. By 2022, it had built up its story in the imagination of the West, and things were very different when the war on Ukraine began. A particular incident that I found fascinating was that in the run-up to war, the Netflix show Emily in Paris featured a Ukrainian character who was a kleptomaniac. The Ukrainian government confronted Netflix over that representation, knowing that a war with Russia was possible, but they still thought it was important to deal with this issue of reputation. And the foreign minister said, for us, reputation is our security. One of the things I like about the concept is that it doesn't have to be national, it doesn't have to be unilateral. It's something that's addressed at a regional or indeed a system-wide level. And there are lots of examples of the European Union working collectively to advance its reputation. I think, therefore, that policies should change in order to fit this concept, and that's what I talk about in the book. The introduction is really the little thing that I just gave you, but with footnotes. Chapter 1 sets out the frame, objective, and agenda for reputation, what it can do to defend a country. The second chapter deals with the problems that come from changes in technology, to try and explain why reputation is so much of a problem right now. And I make the argument that whenever there's a new technology, we are more likely to have international relations boil over, because our ability to understand or to inoculate ourselves against media manipulation has to accumulate over exposure to that media. So, in fact, in the chapter, I argue that the worst things in the 20th century were exacerbated by the experience of new media, the way in which newspapers, the new mass circulation newspapers, led to World War I, or the conditions for World War I, the way in which the rise of Hitler is dependent on new media like newsreels and radio. The third chapter looks at counter-propaganda and its relationship to reputational security. There are cases relating to World War II and the US study of media, of rumor as a component of enemy propaganda and countering that. And then I look at what USIA did to defeat reputational attacks during the Cold War, specifically the libel that the US had developed AIDS as a chemical weapon. Chapter 4 deals with media development, looking at the ways in which free media can help other countries to insulate themselves from reputational attacks. And I've got a case based around the role of Radio Free Europe in promoting change in Armenia in 2017. Chapter 5 deals with information disarmament and the way in which, when two superpowers are attacking each other's reputation, they can actually build that into the diplomatic process. This is something that Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated, and it's almost totally forgotten in the main narrative of how the Cold War came to an end. I see this as very problematic and have sought to address it in that chapter. Chapter 6 is about diaspora diplomacy, the way in which diasporas are part of reputations, for better or worse. And I think that's a really exciting element in contemporary public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and I was glad to be able to explore that in the chapter. Chapter 7 is the one where I make arguments really around cultural diplomacy being one of the most useful mechanisms that we have to build reputational security. And the cases include an amazing exhibit that Taiwan sent to the 2019 Venice Biennale, and the State Department tour of comedians to India called Make China War, sending diaspora comedians from the United States, Indian diaspora comedians, to India to perform. Finally, there's a chapter on rethinking US public diplomacy, talking about the stuff that was achieved the hard way during the last administration, but also I thought that the limits were as limited as public diplomacy could be. So complaining that Liz Allen wasn't actually confirmed until halfway through the administration was one of the points. Now I know how it can be so much worse. You can read that. You can speed read that chapter. And finally, my final chapter looking at how reputational security is working for Ukraine in the first year of its war with of Russia's war. Now, the implications for cultural diplomacy. I think that the concept of reputational security changes the importance of cultural work. It moves international cultural work into a priority category, arguing that to have a positive reputation is defensive to the country and not just a nice to have optional extra. But within this, there has also to be a change of emphasis. I think that the best emphasis for cultural diplomacy should be focusing on building trust, because trust is the foundation for partnership. And without partnership, we're not going to be able to solve the problems that we face in the world today. It also should change activities. We need more collaborations. A culture, as the quote which Sky read argues, collaborations are, culture is an area for collaboration. It's quite a low risk area for collaboration. If a cultural collaboration goes wrong, the problem is a bad review in the Daily Telegraph in London or the Wall Street Journal. If a collaboration on infrastructure goes wrong, it could be a complete catastrophe. But I think we need to think about moving cultural diplomacy away from the sort of showing off type of enterprises that were part of the soft power era. And finally, I believe that this changes the boundaries of cultural diplomacy, that our conversation about cultural diplomacy has to include cultural diplomacy speaking back about ending negatives or addressing negatives. I thought it was really interesting that part of Korea's cultural diplomacy has included legislation around the Korean diet, removing one particular controversial item from food consumption in Korea, and acknowledging that that has been a problem historically. These things together have the power to change the world. We have to know each other if we are to work together, and it's only through working together that we can solve the problems that we know the world faces. And every time you turn on the TV, you hear about climate, you hear about the dangers inherent in artificial intelligence, you hear about the challenge of the chaos that can come from mass migration. All of these are going to need collaboration. So my conclusion, my way ahead, well, reputational security is already being used as an argument for the budget, especially in European countries. This is now part of how the foreign ministry talks to the treasury. It's also an argument for cooperation, for working together in the cultural sector. I think that our ability as states to be cooperative will be an important metric for the future of our reputations. That the countries that can play well with others will be the countries that have good reputations in the 21st century. The countries that keep alone, that want to be excellent by themselves, these places will have problems and are already showing themselves to have more problems. But the mindset, the core of the mindset moving forward, and I say this in the book, is that we have to listen to global responses. And listening is always difficult, in part because we're blind to our own biases. We don't see what others see and often have minimal understanding of what our reputation even is in the world, mistaking the things that people like about us and the things they dislike. We have to remember that though reputations are durable, they are not permanent. And I usually round off this conversation by saying that a good reputation is like a golden egg that's been laid by a magical goose. And you have to take care of that goose. You have to recognize what your golden eggs are and aren't, and take care of the elements of your domestic life that are that resonate with international audiences. And for the United States and the UK, that includes taking care of the university sector. It includes taking care of the arts and humanities. These things that are respected internationally. Step one, listen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this event. And let me begin by saying how grateful I am to the Lois Roth Foundation and the Public Diplomacy Council of America for this award. It's a real honor to receive a prize named for Richard Arndt, whose work did so much to establish the importance of cultural diplomacy, both through his scholarship and his work, making that diplomacy a reality while in government service. And I'm especially grateful to the jury for their generous reading of my book, and to Professor Deborah Cohen and to Pauline Yang for their work guiding that process. And indeed, I was pretty excited to even make the distinguished 6-book shortlist, the range of which I think speaks to the strength of the scholarship in recent years in this area. Books like Jennifer Lynn's Beethoven in Beijing and Alexis Perry's work on the correspondence between American and Soviet women are really excellent works that I'm really proud to have my book listed alongside. But I also want to say a special thanks to Professor Cull for that excellent presentation as ever, and for his major contribution to this field, to the study of the history of cultural diplomacy. I cite just a few of Nick's important works in my book, and really it's truly an honor to be receiving this award alongside someone who's made such a major contribution to the field. So I'm keen to allow as much time for discussion and questions as possible, and Professor Cohen has already kindly given an excellent introduction to my book, so I'll keep my comments fairly brief. I thought I'd focus on just 2 broad points of reflection today. First, I wanted to go into a little bit of detail about what I was trying to achieve in my book, particularly in light of what the committee highlighted about the work in their citation. And secondly, I thought I'd offer just a few tentative reflections on how the history I discussed in the book of US-China relations in the 1970s speaks to our present moment. So I'm really delighted that the jury highlighted 3 things about my book. First and most importantly, the role of cultural diplomacy in making the modern US-China political relationship. I think this is the most fundamental point that I wanted to demonstrate in the book. When I started my research for this project, I read many very good histories of US-China relations, but they paid attention only really to the geopolitical aspects of that relationship, particularly things like shared opposition to the Soviet Union. And these works barely mentioned the relationship between American and Chinese societies in the 1970s. So I was surprised then when I went into the archives in both countries, and I found a real wealth of evidence of both extensive societal interactions and as well the influence that these people-to-people contacts had on the overall relationship between the 2 countries. In the US, I saw lots of documents from people like Henry Kissinger talking extensively about cultural diplomacy and thinking carefully about how that could benefit the relationship, but also how scandals or points of conflict in cultural diplomacy also had a negative effect on the relationship. And this was something that I'd not read in that existing literature and historiography. So my book tried to make use of evidence from those government archives, but also from non-government archives and from personal archival collections, as well as from oral history interviews, to tell the story of those interactions and to argue that cultural diplomacy, those interactions, really mattered in the overall diplomatic relationship. The second thing I was very glad that the jury highlighted was the role of both individuals, but also of non-governmental organizations in the US-China relationship. And Professor Cohen mentioned that in her introduction, the role of institutions. A lot of the story I tell in the book is about remarkable individual experiences, the experiences of ping-pong players, but also of musicians, scientists, students, visitors to the other country, hosts in those countries, translators who made the cultural diplomacy possible, and many others besides. And I really loved hearing these stories from the people I interviewed, or finding accounts of these personal interactions in the archives in China and the United States, or in memoirs in both countries that are often really striking to read, but perhaps not widely read at this point in time. In many cases, though, the influence of these individuals was, I thought, enhanced through their work in collectives. Scientists often work through scholarly organizations that reached out to their counterparts in the other country, from the US to China or vice versa. And they thus work to turn usually individual visits or visits of small groups of researchers into the basis of meaningful, ongoing collaboration between entire fields in these two countries. And on the other side of cultural diplomacy, the sort of more cultural aspects, one of the most important US institutions, American institutions in the book, is the National Committee on US-China Relations. And I cover the founding of that organization in 1966 and their early role in US-China exchanges, for example, hosting the very first exchange delegation sent from the People's Republic of China, the second leg of ping-pong diplomacy in 1972. And the National Committee on US-China Relations continues to exist, and they continue to facilitate cultural exchange with China all the way down to the present, in spite of the challenges that they and others have faced in recent years. And I think two examples from my book can give a sense of where that individual and collective contribution intersect. And those are scientists from each side, or two scientists, one from each side. On the US side, Frank Press was a groundbreaking seismologist, and he was known, among other things, for his work that allowed us to measure earthquakes on the ocean floor, and even through the Apollo program on the moon. And in 1974, he led the first US delegation of seismologists to China. From the following year, Frank Press chaired the most important US non-governmental organization for scientific contacts with China, which was a committee that was run out of the National Academy of Sciences, before he was tapped by President Jimmy Carter to become the presidential science advisor and the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, from which he oversaw the rapid development of US-China scientific ties from the late 1970s, drawing extensively on his experience as a practicing scientist, but also as someone who'd been involved in non-governmental organizations that worked with their Chinese counterparts. Meanwhile, on the Chinese side, Zhou Peiyuan was a leading Chinese theoretical physicist who'd earned his doctorate at Caltech and then spent a sabbatical year at Princeton, where he took part in Einstein's relativity seminar. But he returned to post-revolution China, and he played a central role in the building of institutional scientific networks between China and the outside world, including in the 1970s with the United States, often working with Frank Press, or at least the organizations that Frank Press was leading, both while Frank Press was in government and before that as well. So the history of individuals like this, and that's just a couple of examples from the book, and the institutions that they work to build, points to the importance of the work of non-governmental organizations, including, of course, the Public Diplomacy Council of America and the Lois Roth Foundation, but also, many similar groups in the United States, in China, and elsewhere today. And finally, the jury highlighted how my book explores the agency of Chinese individuals and organizations in the 1970s. And that aspect of the story was really important to me for this book. Much of the history of US-China relations, written until the relatively recent past, had to be based largely or wholly on US sources, as there was such limited access to Chinese sources, especially from Chinese archives. There were still challenges to doing historical research in China when I was writing this book. I started this project just after the very brief golden age in which you could actually access the Chinese Foreign Ministry archive, and that archive had already effectively closed when I was doing this research. And it was not easy getting to other archives or access to other useful material in China. But ultimately, the kind of sources that were important, particularly to this kind of history, the history of interactions between Chinese and Americans at a more societal, people-to-people level, proved to be more accessible in Chinese archives. And I was able to get what I felt were important sources from multiple archives and as well from published primary source collections available in China. These sources were never as detailed as those I had on the American side of the story, but they nonetheless allowed me to show the experience of societal reconnection from China's perspective, and as well to analyze how seriously the Chinese government took cultural diplomacy with the United States as part of the overall bilateral relationship, mirroring what I mentioned earlier, Henry Kissinger's perception and other US policymakers' perceptions of the importance of cultural diplomacy. So I thought, as I said at the beginning, that I'd also use this opportunity to reflect a little bit on how my book speaks to our present moment. And that's a question that I've thought about a fair bit since I finished the book. It's been a period of much upheaval in US-China relations, not least in the relationship between the two societies. And much has changed, of course. But in a way, I think, as Professor Cohen mentioned earlier, I think that the book is at least as relevant now, a few years after I sent it off to be published, as it was when I finished the writing. At the time, the severe downturn in US-China relations of the late 2010s could still seem like something of an aberration. And the sharp decoupling that was prompted by COVID could seem like a dramatic, but maybe still temporary, interruption to a longer trend of connection. And I think that's much harder to believe now. It now seems clear that we're in a much more durable period of rivalry and estrangement between the United States and China. I think that the history of US-China relations of 50 or so years ago is actually useful here, though, because it reminds us of the long-term ups and downs in the relationship. And it reminds us that upturns in relations, such as that was seen in the 1970s, were often hard to predict before they happened, even as the underlying basis for those upturns was being laid. My book has a prologue which talks about the fact that cultural diplomacy continued in very limited form between the United States and China, even in the 1960s during China's Cultural Revolution, even in the 1950s at a real high point in the Cold War, and just years after China and the US had fought a hot war in Korea. I think that this reminds us that cultural exchanges may be especially important in moments of estrangement like this. The 1970s in US-China relations is famous for many firsts, beginning with ping-pong diplomacy and then followed by many other breakthrough moments that I cover in the book: the first delegation of physicists in each direction, the first university students to go abroad to study in each country, and the first time that American and People's Republic of China athletes competed against each other, as they would do so notably in many Olympic Games that have followed. But alongside those firsts, one of the things that struck me in the archives was that although discontinuity was obviously the larger trend, it was not the whole story. There were also some continuities that had survived more than 20 years of near total isolation between the US and China, or at least their societies, between 1949 and 1971. Some American scientists had memories of earlier work in China or with Chinese scientists, and a whole generation of Chinese scientists had experienced scientific cooperation with countries like the United States, where they'd often trained and researched before the Second World War and China's 1949 revolution, just as Zhou Peiyuan had. And this was true of at least some social scientists and humanists too, some of whom had experiences studying or researching in the other country in or before 1949. And they knew people on the other side with which they tried to reconnect after 1971, after the two sides established the beginning of their cultural exchange program. Now, naturally, more than 20 years of interruption, of course, mattered a great deal. But those earlier links also meant that when the relationship began to reopen, people were not always starting completely from nothing. And one point I take from that history is that the long-term basis for cultural exchange and cultural diplomacy is often established at times like this, when ties are strained. Cultural diplomacy can be one of the things that makes it possible for some relationships to survive periods of tension and sometimes to be rebuilt later, both human relationships, but also relationships in terms of relationships between states. But I'd also add a second, more cautious point that I tried to make in the book as well, which is that we should not romanticize cultural exchange and the benefits that it brings. It is not true that cultural exchange always brings easy understanding, and it's not true that it always makes for more accurate understandings either. And I think the evidence that I saw about the 1970s in US-China relations really bore this out. Some American visitors to China in the Mao era were shown carefully choreographed versions of Chinese society. And in some cases, those visits could lead to quite inaccurate understandings, held with the confidence of people who thought that they had witnessed these things firsthand for themselves. And yet still, on aggregate, I think cultural exchange did make for better, deeper understandings of the other society in the case of the United States and China in the 1970s, even if that did not always mean a uniformly positive understanding of the other side. These cultural exchanges made the relationship thicker. They expanded and diversified the range of Chinese and Americans who were involved in the relationship to include biologists, journalists, sports people, local politicians, academics, filmmakers, and many more. And all of these people had their own motivations for participation in the relationship, and they found their own benefits from this participation. Cultural exchange changed whole fields of academic study in the US and China. It provided inspiration for new sports to gather followings in both countries, and it powerfully transformed university education in the United States and in China in ways that are still felt today. And together, these ties really mattered to the political relationship, even as well as they had their own intrinsic value that was less connected to politics. And that history seems to me to be very important right now and of some encouragement to those of us who see value in relations between China, the United States, and the outside world more broadly. At moments when the official relationship is dominated by suspicion, by competition and security concerns, it's easy to think of US-China relations only as a relationship between two states or two sets of leaders. But many of these sorts of societal interactions continue between the two sides in spite of geopolitical tension, even if there are more barriers and frictions today as there were even just 10 years ago. Chinese students still study in the US in large numbers. Some American students still go to China, and academics and researchers in industry still work with each other between the two countries. Just like in the 1970s, then, there are many things that divide Chinese and Americans today, and there really were many things that divided the two sides in the Mao era. But I think that only strengthens the case for the careful work of cultural and public diplomacy by both sides. So to reiterate, I'm honored to be a co-winner of this prize, and I'm very pleased to be part of this important conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you to Pete and to Nick for your terrific talks, and congratulations to both of you. I think that we have seen demonstrated through their talks today the power of the ideas, the deep substantiation of and granularity of the research, and the building up to these remarkable theoretical and concrete ideas for the value of cultural diplomacy and the importance of cultural diplomacy and its relevance today. So with that, we do have a few moments that we can open up for questions. So, and just one second, there is going to be a microphone that's going to come around so that people on Zoom can hear.
Thank you. Sherry Mueller, American University. Deborah and Pauline should receive great thanks from all of us for making such wise decisions and as we experience. So special thanks for today. from Sky and the Lois Roth Foundation and PDCA, of course, Ambassador Wayne. Nick, would you be kind enough to talk more about the soft power index and who measures soft power out there? Because I think the soft power index actually is from the UK. And then Pete, if you would be kind enough to talk about Xi Jinping and his Iowa friends, and do they make any difference in your view? Thank you both.
Well, just to speak briefly about the measurement of soft power, I think measurement is a hard thing to do, and it's a hard thing to do properly. And there are multiple soft power indices out there. The one that I referenced, the Soft Power 30, was run by a consultancy based in London, and the publicity around that index included USC. What I pay most attention to is actually not a soft power index, but public opinion polling. I look at what Pew shows us and the work of Richard Wyke, and I pay attention to Simon Anholt and his Nation Brands Index. And the most important thing that both of these are showing right now is shall we say, a transition in the standing of the United States, which has always been in the top 10, even when the Iraq War was at its height, but has now, this time last year, Anholt was finding the US worldwide had slipped to number 15. And heaven knows what it will be when we hear the results for this year in October. Reputation Lab, which is a UK-based, were finding the US was number 47, but they tend, because of the things they study, they tend to be more volatile than Anholt. That's what I'm tracking. But it is hard to do, and you have to be super selective in the indices that you look at, because essentially, I think if an index is moving a lot, it's unreliable, because part of what we know about reputation is that reputations are really hard to shift, either to the positive or to the negative, that people really like their ideas and hold on to them through thick and thin. And if these change, it means something must be really good or really bad.
Thanks for the question. It's always a hard thing to guess at what Xi Jinping is thinking and the basis for his decisions. And at the same time, I think that the fact that Xi has had some US exposure, not very much US exposure, but at least a little bit of US exposure, is that famous visit to Iowa, has helped form the basis of some of his personal relationships with American leaders and other Americans. He has a somewhat working relationship with the current president, and he had a working relationship with President Biden as well. And I think that their conversations about the United States is one of the ways that they've established that relationship. But I'd also mention something else, which is that the United States has a very developed and very sophisticated academic industry in studying China and trying to understand China. But it's also important we remember that China has a very sophisticated and developed industry in studying the United States and understanding what the United States is and why the United States makes the decisions that it does. And I think that the individual experiences of leaders in both countries, including Chinese leaders, helps them digest that information and make more accurate decisions when they're crafting China policy towards the United States. That actually might make China policy, more effective, but we'd hope that it was also more realistic about the United States.
And we do have an online question as well. Thank you for this event and for your valuable insights. Would you please shed light on those factors that could make cultural diplomacy both more effective and efficient?
I'd jump in on that, Pete, and say a budget. And not firing people.
I certainly would agree with that. Maybe a broader reflection I'd add is that in the case study that I looked at, maybe cultural diplomacy was often most effective when both China and the United States were, as Nick said in his presentation, welcomed to sort of more honest appraisals about their country, and they welcomed, you know, a range of opinions about their country being showcased to the other side, and not simply, you know, trying to get people to go to the Grand Canyon and get a very limited impression of that country, but instead a more sophisticated, more varied impression as well.
Thank you very much. Carla Cabrera just defended my PhD dissertation on public diplomacy last month. And my question is a little bit more, not that specific. With the increasing polarization that we're seeing now in the world, I wonder what's your take on how much more political cultural diplomacy is becoming? We have seen a lot of tourists coming to the United States just because of politics. We have also seen a politicization of sports and sports diplomacy. We've seen Spanish fans all over the world just because of Spanish government's stand on Gaza. So I wonder, to what extent do you think that cultural diplomacy is becoming political and is stopping individuals from doing cultural exchanges in countries that are not like-minded or that defend values that are completely opposite or different to the country where they live?
This is a great question. And one of the things, a point I make in the book, is that attacks on cultural diplomacy and erosion of cultural diplomacy is actually one of the testaments to its value. In the book, I describe the Taliban attack on the British Council in Kabul, and they understood the threat that the British Council represented to what they wanted to do and how they wanted to hold back the people of Afghanistan. I think that of course, I recognize the world that you describe, but I feel that the kinds of links that Pete has documented, the kinds of links between people that we see in the world now are all the more precious. And that the World Cup was a great example of this. And of course, it was used as grandstanding by the usual suspects, but the winners were the cultural diplomacy shone through.
Yes.
And the countries with convivial fans were loved, and that the hospitality of the United States was understood and valued by people who were visiting. People seeing Mexico were amazed that it was not all through an orange filter like in Breaking Bad, but was a sophisticated country that looked a lot like Spain. So I think there was tremendously positive things came from and come from these human interactions. And even though a lot in cultural diplomacy is a mess right now, things are still going on, exchanges are still happening. And I should say that next month I'm headed to Italy as a Fulbrighter. I know Dick would love this, as a Fulbrighter to study cultural diplomacy. This is possible even in current circumstances. The State Department is still able to bless cultural diplomacy when it's funded. As in the case of the Fulbright, that particular one is funded by the Italians. So if Congress zeroed out the budget, it could still happen. But there's more happening than the negative headlines might suggest.
I just add to that very important and complete answer that I think that politics being part of cultural diplomacy is a constant, and that's been the case in the past. Of course, there are developments that the question mentioned that are new, but in my case study, a lot of the people that were attracted to go to China in the very early 1970s were very interested in politics. They were very interested in China's politics and particularly Mao's politics. But actually cultural diplomacy was important in those cases as well, because when those people went to China, some of them saw what they thought they were going to see, and their politics didn't change, perhaps they even deepened. But many people realized that the reality of Mao's China was different to that they'd imagined from afar. And they left with a different impression of the country and maybe a more complete understanding of Mao's ideas in practice. And I think therefore that cultural diplomacy, even if politics is part of the motivation of people's interest in other countries, cultural diplomacy can still take place and can temper or problematize some of the views that people have because of their existing political persuasions. But it's a very thoughtful question and an important one for all of us.
A couple online. Is that okay for taking online? So one of our questions, how can the logic of reputational security be employed to counter the global attack on democracy undertaken by a variety of actors?
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, my chief reaction to that is by understanding that democracies are perceived collectively. And this is one of the mistakes, that if one democracy goes off the rails, all democracies suffer. So I think that this means we need to help each other. And sometimes the best help we can do is to point out one another's flaws. In relationships, part of what a friend does, or a spouse, is to say, better not tell that joke again, or that wasn't the best tie to wear today. This is sometimes what we have to do, and the importance of one another's reputation is I think a collective concern, and some of this has been happening. In fact, I talk about it in the chapter on journalist education, where the UK was involved in a free media agenda, which involved telling allies who wish to be democracies that freer media is part of building a democracy. And this led to difficult conversations with some friendly countries in the Middle East, should we say. But yes, we have to acknowledge that we're being confronted, and we have to help each other to be our best selves.
Much, retired public diplomacy officer and sometimes scholar. I have a quick question for each of you. For Peter, I lived in Japan in the early 70s when the United States first established relations with the PRC. And one of the things the Japanese got very huffy about was the cultural similarity between the United States and China. And as kind of a sometime Asia hand, I have to say, I feel more culturally proximate to Chinese than any other Asian culture, despite the political differences. How can we build on that? And for Nick, I just want to endorse your point about co-creation in the cultural sphere. I wrote about this in an article that I believe the USC magazine published. I really think that co-creation is the way to go. And I'd like to hear some current examples.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that thoughtful question. And certainly that was the experience of others in the 1970s. Many Americans who went to China were really surprised by the things that they found at least resonant with their own American values and with their own interests. And I think, that speaks again to the importance of cultural diplomacy and to, for example, actual interpersonal exchanges and getting below that high politics level of, Maoist diatribe or Cold War rhetoric in the United States, and having people in academic fields or sports people, collaborate with the other side and then find out that there's more in common between the two sides than they thought. And I think maybe the lesson for our future is to preserve what we have with China as best we can and to continue to cultivate opportunities for those types of interactions wherever possible, while also respecting the political differences that we have and those important political differences with China.
And I have a couple of examples. In the book, I talk about a prize for filmmaking that's been created by the Bosch Foundation in Germany, where cross-cultural collaborations in filmmaking can be rewarded. I also talk about the way in which Denmark and the Palestine Authority collaborated for an exhibit at the Venice Biennale in 2019, which is a really interesting example of Denmark kind of making the Danish space available for a Palestinian science fiction film. Actually, it's you can watch it on Netflix. It's a 20-minute film about an apocalypse in Bethlehem. And finally, the UK currently has a British Council has just announced grants for to fund collaborations in the cultural sphere, which interestingly have been shared by the Canadian government cultural diplomat. So it's interesting to see who's tuning into these collaborative examples. But I absolutely, collaboration is, to me, is the next big thing and something I'll be looking for in my Fulbright research.
I know we did have an online question. Often when we program experts in a particular field at embassies overseas, Washington will nix them if they differ at all from current administration policy. That, however, makes the speakers even more credible. What is the best balance of finding experts who are credible but don't undermine U.S. foreign policy?
That's a good one. Well, I think that when I was writing my history of USIA, it was really interesting to find these moments when oppositional figures were sent overseas. So the decision as part of US public diplomacy to China to send Daniel Ellsberg as a dissident to talk about what was it like to be a dissident for the United States, or my friend Bob Banks, when he was in Argentina as PAO, he had the idea to send down Noam Chomsky and to say, the US is prepared to send Noam Chomsky to Argentina to talk about how horrible the United States is. Noam Chomsky was not prepared for the trip. He hadn't checked that his passport was in date, and somehow the State Department managed to get him a passport within 6 hours, so that it was possible for him to travel. But I absolutely feel that people who are critical are more credible. And one of the great cultural diplomacy things I've ever seen was the Scottish play Black Watch, sent to the United States, a pro-soldier but anti-war play while the Iraq War was actually in progress. It toured the United States, it toured Australia and New Zealand. Had All Quiet on the Western Front been available during World War I really doubt the Kaiser would have sent it on tour. Yeah. But that was what the government of Tony Blair thought was appropriate. It's what the devolved government of Scotland thought was appropriate. And National British Council funding went into that. Maybe we couldn't quite imagine that happening today, but it was a really important and successful, impactful thing to do. And I hope that it'll be possible for countries to do that at some point in the future.
Pete, did you want to say anything?
Just to further add on to that point, that, I totally agree that sort of privileging leadership in those fields, in the fields of expertise, is the best way to do so, and then defending those individuals as leaders in those fields if they face criticism, whether from within that country, within the US government, or from the other side as well. A lot of times in the 1970s, the Chinese government was critical of social scientists that were sent to American social scientists that were sent to China or to others for making critical comments to their Chinese counterparts. And the US government did well to, defend the principle of the free exchange of those ideas. They didn't internally. The documents I said that I saw showed that they were often pretty unhappy about some of the scandals that were caused by these things, but they defended the principle that those individuals were sent on these cultural exchanges, and therefore that they were free to express their opinions, even if they were critical of the other side or critical of the United States as well.
But this kind of, Pete, goes to a point that was made earlier about what are the preconditions for cultural diplomacy. And I think some kind of firewall really helps, and allowing cultural diplomats and cultural figures to be themselves and not expecting them to be the ventriloquist dummy of the state. And part of the problems in American cultural diplomacy have often come from the president being challenged, or some other public figure being challenged about things in cultural diplomacy, like poor old Harry Truman being asked about the art exhibit that had gone to Prague. Do you really think that's art? And President Truman actually gave his opinion on what was art and what wasn't. He should have been able to say, well, that's not up to me. It's been chosen by experts who know better than I do what best represents the United States. The case I spoke of, the comedians going to India, that was attacked by Senator Paul. How absurd it is that taxpayers' money is being spent on sending comedians to India. What a ridiculous use of American money. But when one of the comedians is Muslim, one is Hindu, and one is a Sikh, and their jokes are about how their identities play out in a different environment, it's a profound and transformative cultural experience that shows India a way of moving beyond fault lines that may yet wreck the country. And no better way of spending money, in my opinion.
And that is a perfect note. Thank you to our speakers. Congratulations. Thank you to PDCA, and thank you to the LRF.
Here's the mic. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. More thank yous to come. And just first an anecdote, if I may indulge. I'm Carl Stoltz, co-president of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. I was a cultural warrior back in the 1990s in USIA at another time of massive budget cuts and a profound debate within USIA over whether we needed culture. We could just dispense with English teaching, arts programs, Fulbright scholarships to save money for other resources that we felt were a priority. And I was right in the middle of that because I was the cultural coordinator for the East Asia Pacific region. And a wonderfully dynamic, I'm not going to name names, but a wonderfully capable public affairs officer in Canberra in Australia retorted when this debate was going on that we've had about 20 high-level visits to Australia in the last 10 years. And nobody, if asked, can remember exactly what was said and when that visit occurred, including in some cases the principals who participated, not remember exactly when it happened and what was said. But she said everybody in the country remembers a concert we did 10 years ago. And that is reputational security.
Yes, absolutely.
So I want to thank everyone who made today's program possible. First and foremost, the Lois Roth Foundation and the legacy of Richard Arndt. Sky, thank you so much. Thank you to the jury. Thank you to the people at the Institute of Public Diplomacy and Global Communications